My name doesn't matter right now because by the end of this story, you won't see me the same way I used to see myself. You'll understand why I'm not who I thought I was, why I can't even recognize the person I used to be, and why I sometimes look in the mirror and see not just me, but her, staring right back. This is the story of how my aunt made me her perfect twin, and how it changed my life forever. If you think this is some light-hearted story, you're wrong. This is the kind of story that once you start listening to, you won't be able to stop until you reach the very last word, because I couldn't stop living it, and every twist pulled me deeper. It started the summer I was sent to stay with my aunt. My parents were traveling overseas for work, and instead of leaving me alone, they dropped me off at her place. I remember the way her house looked the first day I arrived, standing like something out of another world compared to the cramped apartment I grew up in. It was tall and filled with these wide windows that reflected sunlight in a way that almost blinded me. But what stood out more was her. My aunt looked nothing like the women in my family. Where my mom was plain, simple, and practical, my aunt was glamorous, almost theatrical. She wore long dresses even in the middle of the day, her hair styled as if she was about to go to a photo shoot, and she carried herself with this quiet command that made you feel like you had to notice her. I hadn't seen her in years. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "You've grown into him, but I wonder how much of her you still carry." At the time, I didn't know what she meant. From the first night, I noticed something strange. Her house was filled with mirrors, not just in the bathroom or bedrooms, but in hallways, on doors, even on the walls of the living room. And she kept looking at me in them, as though she wasn't just checking herself but measuring me against some invisible standard. It was on the third day when she started making her request, or maybe I should say her demand, though she delivered it with a smile so calm it felt impossible to refuse. We were sitting at breakfast, and out of nowhere she said, "You know, when I was your age, people always told me I looked like your mother. But that wasn't true. She never had my eyes, my smile, my grace. You have them, though." She leaned closer. "It's like you're the shadow I never had." I laughed nervously, not sure what she was getting at, but then she set her coffee cup down and said the words that started it all, "I want to see what you look like as me." I thought she was joking. Who wouldn't? But that afternoon, she appeared with clothes hers, of course laid out on her bed. "Just try them," she said. "For me. For curiosity." At first, I refused. I felt awkward, out of place. But she had this way of insisting that didn't sound like pressure, it sounded like fate. "If you trust me, you'll understand," she said softly. I don't know what made me agree. Maybe it was her voice, or maybe it was the way she looked at me as if she already knew I'd say yes. She dressed me carefully, piece by piece, adjusting every detail. She brushed my hair in a way I'd never seen done before, moving slowly, almost ceremonially. Then came the makeup, the jewelry, and finally, she stepped back, her hands clasped together like she was witnessing something sacred. "Look," she whispered, and turned me toward the mirror. I froze. It wasn't me. It was her. Her face, her poise, her very presence reflected back at me like some cruel trick of glass. I reached up and touched my cheek, but the reflection did the same, perfectly, like an echo. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. "You see it, don't you?" she asked, her voice trembling with excitement. "You're my twin. My perfect twin." I told myself it was just a game, a costume, a strange obsession of hers. But it didn't end that day. Every morning, she would bring out another outfit. Every evening, she'd sit me in front of those mirrors, adjusting me, perfecting me. At first, I resisted, but the more she worked on me, the harder it became to deny the resemblance. And with every transformation, she grew prouder, while I grew more conflicted. What disturbed me most wasn't her obsession, it was mine. Somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that maybe she was right. Maybe there was a part of me that wasn't just me, but her. And the more I looked in those mirrors, the more I couldn't tell where she ended and I began. One night, as the cicadas screamed outside and the house felt too big and too quiet, she asked me to sit in her study. The room was dim, filled with books and the scent of old perfume. She placed a photo album in my lap. Inside were pictures of her when she was young, but at first glance, I thought they were of same eyes, same shape of the face, same crooked smile I had never noticed before. Do you understand now? She said softly. You were meant for this. Meant to carry me forward. Not as my nephew. As my twin. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow. The pictures didn't lie. The resemblance was undeniable. From that night on, things shifted. It wasn't just play anymore. She started teaching me how to walk like her, talk like her, even gesture with the same tilt of her head. She corrected me when I slipped, her voice sharp but always laced with this strange affection, as though she wasn't scolding me but sculpting me. At first, I thought I'd go mad from the pressure, but over time, something inside me cracked. I stopped fighting. I let myself become what she wanted, and disturbingly, it felt easier. Natural. As though I wasn't losing myself, but uncovering something that had been buried all along. The real breaking point came weeks later when she took me out in public. It was supposed to be impossible. I was terrified someone would see through me. But we walked side by side, dressed identically, styled down to the smallest detail, and not a single person questioned it. People smiled, waved, even complimented us as if we were sisters. My heart pounded the whole time, waiting to be exposed, but the exposure never came. Instead, the lie became the truth. When we got home, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. You're not my shadow, she said. You're my reflection. My second chance. I didn't know what to say. Because deep down, I had started to believe it too. But here's where the suspense deepens, because what she gave me wasn't just a disguise. It was an identity. And when my parents finally returned to pick me up, I stood in front of them and saw their confusion. They didn't recognize me. Not fully. My mother blinked, and for a split second, I thought she was looking not at me, but at her sister. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I didn't want to go back to being me. I won't spoil the rest because the story doesn't truly end. It's still unfolding. But if you've stayed with me this far, then you understand why I can't untangle myself from her grip, why every mirror still whispers her name when I look into it. I wasn't just dressed as her. I became her. And the question that haunts me now is whether I'll ever be able to become myself again, or if maybe, just maybe, this was who I was meant to be all along. When my parents came back, everything should have gone back to normal. I should have packed my bag, thanked my aunt, and walked out of that mirror-filled house without looking back. But the truth is, the moment I tried to step out of her world, it felt like my skin no longer fit. I carried her inside me, in the way I walked, in the way my hands moved without me realizing, in the way my reflection refused to return to the boy I had been. My parents noticed it too. At dinner that night, my mom kept staring, not with suspicion but with unease, as though I was reminding her of something she had tried to forget. Finally, she said, "You've changed. You look familiar in a way that isn't yours." She didn't say it aloud, but I knew what name was burning on her tongue. Her sister's. I thought the summer was over, but my aunt had planted something inside me that didn't stop growing. She began calling me every night. Not to ask how I was, but to check on me, to remind me not to let go of the lessons she taught me. She'd say things like, "Don't slouch, it ruins the silhouette," or "I can hear it in your voice, you're slipping back, don't undo what we've created." And every time I tried to resist, her words echoed in my head like commands I couldn't ignore. At school, I became restless. I'd catch myself watching girls who had the same grace my aunt drilled into me, not out of attraction but out of recognition, like they carried pieces of the person I was supposed to be. In mirrors, I still saw her face overlapping mine. My friends noticed I was different. They said I moved strangely, too careful, too deliberate. I laughed it off, but deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't just different. I was becoming her. Then came the day she visited us. My parents thought it was a casual family dinner, but I knew better. The moment she walked into the house, dressed in her flowing clothes, her perfume trailing behind her like smoke, I felt the air tighten. She looked at me, then at my mother, then back at me again, and smiled knowingly. Later that evening, when no one was around, she whispered in my ear, "You've let yourself slip. But don't worry. I'll fix you again." I should have told her no. I should have walked away. But when she opened her suitcase in the guest room and revealed the outfits she had packed me duplicates, identical to hers, I felt something inside me yield. It was as if the boy I had been was too weak to resist, and the twin she had sculpted was too strong to deny. We did it again. The transformation. Only this time, it wasn't secret. My mother walked in on us before we could finish. I expected her to scream, to tear me out of those clothes, to confront her sister. But she didn't. She froze, her eyes wide, and for a long moment, she just stared. Then she whispered something I will never forget. "You look more like her than I ever did." And then she walked out, her voice trembling with something I couldn't place: jealousy, fear, maybe both. From that night on, the balance in my family shifted. My mother grew distant, my father stayed oblivious, and my aunt grew bolder. She started taking me out with her regularly, introducing me to people not as her nephew, but as her mirror. And no one questioned it. That was the part that terrified me most. Nobody looked twice. Nobody asked who I really was. The lie had become seamless, convincing even to strangers. But the more convincing I became, the harder it got to know where I ended. My aunt would tell me stories about her youth, about the dreams she never fulfilled, about the places she wanted to go but never did. And then she'd look at me and say, "Now you can do them for me." As me. There were nights I'd wake up sweating, unsure if I was still myself or if I had become nothing more than her extension. I'd stand in front of the mirror, stripping away the clothes, the makeup, everything, trying to see the boy again. But even barefaced, even in silence, her shadow lingered. My smile curved like hers. My eyes held her expression. She had etched herself into me in ways I couldn't erase. The breaking point came during a family gathering. Relatives I hadn't seen in years were there, and when I walked into the room with my aunt, dressed identically, there was a hush. Some of them laughed nervously, some whispered, but then one of my cousins blurted out, "They're twins." Everyone nodded. No one questioned it. And for the rest of the evening, people treated us as if I had never been me at all. That night, lying in bed, I realized I didn't know how to undo this. My aunt had made me her perfect twin, but in the process, she had stolen something I wasn't sure I could get back. And worse, I had let her. The story didn't end there. It can't. Because the more I try to pull away, the more I find myself drawn back. She calls me, she visits me, she reminds me of what I've become. Sometimes I wonder if it's even possible to escape. Or maybe I don't want to escape. Maybe part of me wants to keep being her, because in some twisted way, being her feels more real than being me ever did. And that's the truth I can't run from. My aunt didn't just make me her perfect twin. She made me question who I am, and whether the person I used to be was ever real in the first place. The weeks after that family gathering felt like living inside a dream that wasn't mine. Everywhere I went with my aunt, people believed the story without hesitation. They called us sisters, twins, reflections, and I nodded along, never correcting them, because the truth was harder to explain than the lie. And the more people accepted it, the harder it became to deny. It wasn't just her imagination anymore. It was a reality others were willing to see, and that frightened me more than anything. And why mother avoided the subject completely. She no longer looked me in the eyes. At dinner, she'd focus on her plate, on conversations with my father, but never on me. When she did glance in my direction, it was brief, sharp, as though staring too long would shatter something fragile inside her. My aunt, on the other hand, only grew more confident. She would lean across the table, smile at me, adjust a strand of my hair even when no one else noticed, and whisper under her breath, "Perfect." It wasn't long before she began talking about permanence. Not just the clothes or the makeup, but something deeper. One evening, as she brushed my hair in front of her towering mirror, she said softly, "What if you stopped pretending? What if you stopped being halfway? What if you simply were me, all the time?" I laughed weakly, hoping she was joking, but she wasn't. Her reflection stared back at me with absolute seriousness. "You think you're still him, but look at you. You're not. You haven't been for months. You're mine. My twin. That's the truth." The terrifying part was that some piece of me believed her. Every day I tried to return to my old clothes, my old voice, my old gestures, but they felt foreign, like I was wearing someone else's skin. I'd sit in my room, staring at my hands, and swear they didn't move like mine anymore. They moved like hers. Even in my dreams, I'd hear her voice whispering corrections, adjusting me, guiding me. Then came the first time she asked me to take her place. It was a simple dinner with her friends, she claimed. She said she was too tired, that they wouldn't notice, that it would be harmless. I protested, terrified of being discovered, but she silenced me with one look. "This is what you were made for," she said firmly. "If you can do this, you'll understand." I went. I sat with her friends, smiled when they laughed, answered their questions as though I had lived her life. And they believed it. They believed me. When the evening ended and I returned to her house, trembling with the adrenaline of having pulled it off, she embraced me so tightly I thought my ribs would crack. "See," she whispered. "You're better at being me than I ever was." That night, I lay awake for hours, replaying every moment. A part of me wanted to cry from the weight of the deception, but another part of me buzzed with a strange thrill. For once, I had felt seen, not as the shadow I used to be, but as something undeniable. And yet, the cost was heavy. With every step deeper into her world, I lost sight of my own. By now, my parents hardly recognized me. My father brushed it off, convinced it was just a phase, but my mother knew. She cornered me one night, her voice trembling, her hands clutching my shoulders. "Do you even know who you are anymore?" she demanded. I wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I wasn't sure. And my aunt? She only tightened her grip. She started planning outings where we dressed alike, daring anyone to tell us apart. She began calling me by her own name when we were alone, and if I hesitated to respond, her disappointment cut deeper than any anger could. "Don't resist what you've already become," she'd whisper. The line between us blurred until I couldn't see it anymore. My reflection didn't belong to me. My smile wasn't mine. Even my voice, after so many hours of mimicry, carried her tone. And yet, despite the fear clawing at me, a twisted comfort grew in that identity. Because being her meant being noticed, being admired, being something I had never been on my own. But here's where it turns darker. Because one evening, she asked me to do something I hadn't expected. She wanted me to meet someone important in her life, someone who didn't know me, and convince them utterly, flawlessly that I was her. My heart pounded, my stomach knotted, but when I looked at her, she only smiled with that same serene certainty that had guided every step of my transformation. "You can do it," she said. "You're already me. This is just the proof." And as I stood in front of the mirror that night, dressed, perfected, no trace of who I had once been left in sight, a thought struck me so chilling I could barely breathe. Maybe she wasn't turning me into her at all. Maybe she was erasing herself piece by piece, pouring everything she was into me, until one day, she could vanish, and no one would know the difference. And maybe just maybe I would let her. The night she asked me to take her place with someone important haunted me long before I even agreed. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, because every time I closed my eyes, I imagined myself walking into a room and being unmasked. My heart would pound, and I'd wonder why I kept letting her push me further. But when the day came, she dressed me like it was a ceremony. Every strand of hair pinned exactly, every gesture rehearsed until it was second nature. She stepped back and looked at me not as though I were her nephew, not even as though I were her twin, but as though I was her. Completely. When I asked her what would happen if I failed, she smiled faintly. "You won't. I've made sure of it. And even if you stumble, they'll believe you because the world always believes the reflection over the shadow." Those words stayed in my mind as I walked into that room. It was a quiet restaurant, the kind where people spoke in lowered voices and waited staff glided like ghosts. At the table sat a man I had never seen before, older, dressed neatly, his expression tired yet sharp. He looked up as I approached, and my stomach twisted in fear. But then he smiled. "You look just like I remember," he said. And in that instant, I knew I had passed the first test. The dinner was a blur. I don't even remember half the words I spoke, because they weren't mine, they were hers. I repeated the stories she had told me, mirrored the tone she had drilled into me. Every laugh, every pause, every sigh belonged to her. And the man across from me never questioned it. He looked at me with the warmth of recognition, never once doubting who I was supposed to be. By the end of the night, As he kissed my hand and said goodbye, I realized the terrifying truth. I had not only fooled him, I had convinced myself too. Walking out of that restaurant, I no longer felt like an imposter. I felt like her. When I returned, my aunt's eyes were shining with something I had never seen before. Not pride, not satisfaction, but relief. "You don't understand what you've done," she whispered, clutching my face in her hands. "You've given me back what I lost. You've proven it's possible." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but she wouldn't explain. Instead, she poured me a glass of wine and said only, "Soon you'll know." That word soon chewed in me for days. Soon what? Soon why? The unease grew heavier with each passing night. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something had shifted in her. She didn't dress me as often anymore. She didn't correct me as sharply. It was as if she believed her work was done. And maybe, in her mind, it was. Because I had become her. Even when I tried to return to myself, it didn't work. The clothes I used to wear hung awkwardly on me. My voice slipped into her cadence without my consent. My reflection refused to return to the boy I once knew. And the people around me noticed. At school, teachers remarked that I seemed matured, though they couldn't place why. Friends drifted away, uneasy with the person I had become, someone they couldn't recognize but couldn't name. And through it all, my mother remained silent. Until one night, when she finally broke. She stormed into my room, slammed the door behind her, and hissed, "What has she done to you?" Her eyes were wild, her hands trembling. "I see her in you. Every day, more and more. You don't belong to yourself anymore, you belong to her." I didn't know how to respond, because wasn't that exactly what I felt too? That I had been carved into her image, stripped of my own? But before I could speak, she said something that shattered me. "She's done this before." I stared at her, heart racing. "What do you mean?" My mother sank onto the bed, her face pale. "When we were young, she wanted me to be her. She dressed me up, taught me how to mimic her, made me stand in front of mirrors until I hated my own reflection. I thought it was just a game, a phase, but it was an obsession. I escaped. I thought she'd moved on. But she hasn't, has she? She's just found someone new. You." The room spun around me. My stomach dropped. I couldn't breathe. If what my mother said was true, then I wasn't the first. And if I wasn't the first, then what was I? A replacement? A vessel? I confronted my aunt the next day. My voice shook, but I forced the words out. "Did you do this to her too? Did you try to make her your twin before me?" She didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. She only looked at me with that same serene expression and said, "She wasn't right for it. But you are. You're perfect. You don't understand what a gift this is, what a chance it is. You'll see. In time, you'll thank me." Her certainty terrified me more than her denial ever could have. From then on, everything changed. I could no longer tell if I was living my life or hers. She called me by her name more often than my own, and the worst part was I responded without hesitation. The walls of her house seemed to close in, lined with mirrors that no longer showed me but only her reflection duplicated infinitely. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I began to wonder if there was even a way back. Because what happens when the reflection replaces the original? What happens when people stop seeing you, and only see the one you've been molded into? What happens when you no longer know who you are? After that confrontation, the air in the house felt different. Heavier, charged, as if every mirror and every shadow was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My aunt never raised her voice, never argued, but her silence carried more weight than words ever could. When she did speak, it was calm, precise, and final. "You don't need to be afraid of what you're becoming," she told me one evening as she adjusted the collar of my blouse. "Fear only means you're close to the truth." But fear was all I felt. Fear when I caught myself speaking with her exact phrasing. Fear when I woke up in the middle of the night and, for a split second, didn't remember my own name. Fear when I passed a window and thought I saw her reflection, only to realize it was mine. The worst part was how natural it all felt now. The clothes, the gestures, the smile, things that once seemed foreign now fit like a second skin. Even when I tried to resist, my body betrayed me, slipping back into her posture, her rhythm, her grace. It was like she had stitched herself into my very bones. And yet, underneath the fear, there was something else. A strange pull, a dangerous comfort. Because for the first time in my life, people noticed me. Not as the quiet, forgettable boy I had been, but as someone who drew eyes, who carried a presence that couldn't be ignored. Every compliment, every double take, every whispered "she looks amazing" fed a part of me I hadn't known was starving. And I hated that I didn't hate it. Then came the letter. I found it by accident, tucked inside one of her photo albums. It was old, yellowed at the edges, written in her elegant handwriting. My hands trembled as I read it. My reflection must outlast me. When the time comes, I will not be forgotten, because she will remain. She will carry my name, my face, my life. I will live again through her. Perfect, unbroken, eternal. The words burned into me. It wasn't just obsession, it was her plan. She wasn't shaping me for a game or a fantasy. She was shaping me to replace her. When I confronted her, my voice cracked with desperation. "What are you trying to do to me? Why can't you just let me be me?" She looked at me with eyes that held both love and something far darker. "Because being you is a waste. You were never meant to be small, invisible, forgettable. You were meant to be me. You're my second chance. You're my legacy." I shook my head, but her words wouldn't leave me. Legacy. Reflection. Twin. Replacement. They circled in my mind like vultures, pecking at what little certainty I had left. My mother saw the change too. She begged me to stop going to my aunt's house, but every time I tried to pull away, my aunt would call, her voice calm, reassuring, irresistible. "Just one more time," she'd say. "Just trust me a little longer. You'll see why." And I always went back. The breaking point came one evening when she stood me in front of the mirror, dressed identically to her, our hair styled the same, our faces indistinguishable. She placed her hands on my shoulders and whispered, "Look at us. Which one of us is real? Which one of us matters more? The answer doesn't frighten me anymore. Does it frighten you?" And staring at that reflection, at two faces that were one, I couldn't answer. Because I didn't know. That night I dreamed I was standing in front of an endless hall of mirrors, each one reflecting her, not me. I screamed, but the sound that came out was her voice. I woke up shaking, my pillow damp with sweat, and realized with horror that the dream didn't feel like a dream at all. It felt like a warning. But here's the truth I can't escape. Part of me doesn't want to run. Part of me wants to let go, to surrender to the reflection, to stop fighting and simply become her. Because being her feels powerful. Being her feels alive. Being her feels inevitable. And maybe that's the scariest part of all, that I'm no longer sure I want to be saved. I wish I could tell you that the choice came cleanly, like a light switching on, but the truth is messier. It arrived as a small, ridiculous moment that grew into something I couldn't ignore. I was standing in front of the mirror, as I always was now, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from a teacher I barely knew, asking me if I would consider auditioning for a school play. The note was casual, warm. Someone thought I had something worth seeing. For a second I felt that old hunger, recognition, applause, being noticed for who I was on stage, not for the perfect echo of someone else. The urge surprised me, then frightened me. What would I do if they saw me being me, not her? Would they laugh? Would I be invisible again? When I told my aunt that evening, expecting at best a shrug, she froze. Her face didn't show anger, only calculation. "An audition," she repeated slowly, like tasting a word. "That could be dangerous. Or it could be an opportunity." She came closer and sat on the edge of my bed, hands folded as if delivering a lecture. "You must decide. Do you want to test being yourself under lights, where people might see beyond the surface? Or do you want to step into the light as me, where you are guaranteed their attention?" It felt like a trap. But somewhere inside, a stubborn little voice answered for me before I could overthink it. I wanted to try. I wanted to know whether the boy beneath all of her work still existed, whether his voice still had a place in the world. I signed up for the audition without telling her the details. For the first time in months, I lied to her in a way that felt like reclaiming something. The day of the audition, my palms sweated so badly the paper in my hand blurred. I walked into the cold auditorium and realized something I hadn't felt in a long time. My chest moved with my own nervousness, not with a rehearsed calm. When I stepped onto the stage, lights wood warm and honest, I felt the familiar pang of exposure, but also a thrilling clarity. I read my lines. My voice faltered at first, then steadied. When I finished, there was a small, polite applause, nothing like the adoration my aunt's image drew, but it belonged to me. A kid in the second row mouthed the last line back to me and grinned. I felt something inside unclench. When I returned to the house that night, my aunt was waiting, silhouette elegant in the doorway. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She looked at me with a slow, appraising gaze, like someone watching a work of art from a new angle. "Did they like you?" she asked. It sounded like a test. "They did," I said quietly. "Not because I pretended to be you. Because I was myself." For a heartbeat she looked shaken. Then she smiled small, professional, and said, "Good. Then you know you can still be seen. You can still choose." Those words should have been a relief. They weren't. Because choice had always been the illusion. The next days became a tug-of-war I could feel inside my bones. My mother began to shift too. Seeing me return from the auditorium, cheeks flushed, carrying a small scrap of stage paper, she was gentle in a way I hadn't seen in months. One night she sat beside me on the couch and took my hand. Her fingers trembled as she said, "I'm sorry. I should have told you more about her. I should have warned you." I wanted to ask what she meant, but instead she pulled me in and whispered about memories, how my aunt had once smoothed my mother into an imitation, how my mother had escaped by moving away, changing jobs, shutting that chapter like a door she never wanted to open again. She said, "I thought we were safe." That confession lit something in me, less pity for my mother and more resolve for myself. If this had happened before, if she had done this to my mother, then there was a path out, because my mother had lived through it and survived. But surviving didn't feel like enough. I wanted to take more than survival back. I wanted to rebuild. The confrontation came faster than I expected. My aunt was preparing for a gala, as she called it, a small circle of people who adored her, a night when she would show the world her perfected image. She wanted me to attend as her twin, to stand by her and echo her laughter. I agreed, but only on one condition. I told her I would go, but afterward, I wanted the two of us to finish what we had started, a conversation, pure honesty, no mirrors, no costumes, no audiences. She blinked, and for once I saw hesitation. That was all I needed. At the gala, we were flawless together. People murmured, impressed by how synchronized we looked. I played my part with a strange, clinical precision that night, smiling in the right places, listening, nodding. But underneath the practiced surface, I kept a private tally of every borrowed smile and every stolen gesture. I was counting what I had given away. When the night ended and the house fell quiet, my aunt took me to her study. She poured 2 cups of tea and sat across from me, wrists bare, face soft in the lamplight. "You performed beautifully," she said. "You are proving my point." Her tone was almost tender. "But you also asked for the truth. So here it is." She paused, and when she spoke next it wasn't gentle. "I am afraid of disappearing. I am afraid that one day my features will soften, my audience will move on, and I will be forgotten. If I can make another me, then part of me survives. I'm not cruel. I'm practical. This is how I protect myself." Hearing her say it outright should have made the moment clear-cut, villain and victim. But she didn't sound like a villain to me, sounded like a frightened woman. "You could have come to me," I said. "You could have told me your fear. You could have asked for help instead of forcing yourself into my skin." She looked at me then, and for the first time she seemed small, human even. "I did try," she whispered. "I asked, but nobody wanted to see me. They saw my sister, or they saw you when you reflected me. I thought the only way to survive was to make sure someone carried the shape of me forward." I felt rage, pity, and a weary compassion collide. The room felt too small for the weight of both our histories. I realized then that the person I had been and the person she had been were both trapped in different ways, me trapped by her mirroring project, her trapped by a loneliness that had hardened into strategy. I could have stormed out. I could have called my mother and never returned. Instead I did something neither of us expected. I made a choice that was neither surrender nor outright rebellion. I told her that I would not allow our lives to be a competition of erasure. If you want a legacy, I said quietly, let it include me as myself. Teach me your life, yes, but don't take mine away. Help me be seen for who I am, not just as your shadow. She stared at me as if hearing a language for the first time. And if I refuse? She asked. I looked at my hands, those hands she had so often smoothed into her gestures. Then I'll walk away, I said. And I'll build my life with the parts that are mine. I won't let myself disappear. It wasn't a dramatic, heroic moment. It was quieter, an agreement, awkward and fragile. She exhaled slowly, and for the first time in months, she seemed to let something go. She reached across the table and took my hand. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted. But I don't know if I can live without you either. We moved forward without a single grand resolution. There were no cinematic tears and no legal battles. There were small things. She stopped calling me by her name when we were alone, she let me change my clothes in private, and she began tentatively to teach me about the life she'd lived, not to make me into her, but to share it so I could choose what to take. My mother, relieved but watchful, helped me relearn laughter that belonged to me. I auditioned again and again, not to prove anything to anyone but to myself. Some nights I still caught myself in the mirror and saw her face overlap mine. Other nights I recognized my own laugh and it felt like a small reclamation. The truth is, we both changed. She softened in ways I hadn't thought possible, and I strengthened in ways I hadn't believed I possessed. The reflection didn't vanish, but it stopped trying to swallow me whole. And though the story isn't neatly finished, old habits and old fears linger like shadows. The shape of my life began to solidify into something I could call mine. So no, this isn't the end. It's a vital turn, an uneasy truce, the start of rebuilding. If you want, I can keep going into what that rebuilding looks like, the relapses, the moments of triumph, the public scenes where I finally choose myself in front of everyone, or a longer, quieter epilogue that shows how identity heals over years, not days. Which path do you want me to follow next? The days that followed our quiet truce were not simple or clean. They were full of ordinary, stubborn things that stitch a life back together, small apologies, awkward attempts at boundaries, tests that felt like tiny battles. Some nights she would call me by her name without thinking, as if the old habit was a muscle she hadn't yet retrained. Sometimes I would wake up and find one of her scarves on my dresser and a note that said, "For when you need to feel seen." It read like kindness, but it landed like a claim, and I would fold it away instead of wearing it. Other times she would show up with an old photograph and ask me to sit and listen as she told the story behind it, not to make me into her but to offer it as history, something I could learn from, not inherit obligingly. Relapse was inevitable. I had days where the mirror convinced me of her more convincingly than any person ever could. I would stand in the bathroom and catch my jaw line, the curve of my lips, the way my eyes angled when I smiled, and think, there she is. Those afternoons were hard. They were the territory of private panic where I had to breathe deeply and remind myself of the lines I had spoken on stage as my own. I would hum a fragment of a song I loved, something no one else would associate with her, and feel my chest unclench. The trivial things became anchors, a crooked tooth I'd always hated, the scar near my thumb from falling off my bike when I was 10, a habit of tapping my foot 3 times when I was anxious. They felt ridiculous to treasure, but they were proof. Progress was uneven. At school I found a small group of theater kids who wanted me around because I brought something raw to a senior vulnerability that wasn't polished, that sometimes cracked in the middle of a monologue. They never asked me to be anyone but myself, and the more I practiced that, the thicker my sense of self grew. Each rehearsal was a small reclamation, a place where a shaky line read belonged to me and not some memorized persona. I started getting small roles, not leads, but roles I could touch and make mine. The applause in those rooms tasted different than the public applause my aunt could command. It was quieter, more honest. Someone once said to me after a rehearsal, "You don't hide, you stand." That sentence became a private talisman I repeated in my head. My aunt watched these changes with a complicated face. At first she looked like someone mourning and celebrating all at once. She'd attend a show and clap politely, then pull me aside afterward and say, "You were compelling." Sometimes her praise felt like a relief, sometimes it felt like a new pressure, as if she still expected me to belong to a version of her that I was no longer willing to live inside. I learned to ask for space when that pressure flared, to tell her when something felt like an attempt to reclaim me. She learned, slowly, to accept a no. That, in itself, was a small miracle. My mother and I drifted closer in a way that felt both tender and practical. She shared things about the past she hadn't before, the texture of fear she carried when she left, the shame she'd swallowed and later reshaped into a life that was, by her description, quieter but freer. We both learned how to speak about my aunt without pretending the hurt wasn't there. We practiced sentences that were true and not accusatory, sentences that let us process rather than attack. She became my ally in gentle ways, texting me before major events, showing up without comment, or making a dinner that smelled like comfort. Her presence was steady, not dramatic, and that steadiness kept me anchored on days when the mirror still tried to argue for my erasure. There were public moments that tested everything. Once, during a community arts night, a woman approached me afterward and told me, "You remind me of someone I used to know." For a breathless second my chest went hollow, old terror clamping down. Then I realized the woman meant my aunt's style, and she gave me a gentle smile and said, "But you have your own look. Don't let her take your face." The woman's kindness was a small, bright thing that felt like permission to exist as myself in public. I clutched it like a lifeline. There were arguments, too, fierce and raw. One afternoon my aunt and I had a fight in the kitchen that left both of us shaking. I accused her of slipping back into old habits, gifts that were demands, compliments that felt like territory markers, and she accused me of being ungrateful for what she had given me: confidence, presence, a way of moving through the world. We both said things we regretted. In the quiet after, she sat on the floor and cried in a way I had never seen, not the controlled, composed sadness I'd grown used to, but a fractured grief. I held her then, not as her replica but as a human who had been carved by fear. She admitted that she'd been terrified of being forgotten and had tried to manufacture immortality by copying herself. I admitted that I had been terrified of losing myself and had let her. Neither of those confessions erased what happened, but they opened room for repair. Time, stubborn and slow, became our ally. The repetition of new habits, me refusal to be called by her name, her careful avoidance of mirrors when I visited, my insistence on going to rehearsal alone wove new patterns. She began to volunteer at a community center helping older women learn to use smartphones. It was a timid attempt at building a life that didn't revolve around being seen as a particular face. I continued to audition, to practice, to live in the small versions of joy that belonged to me. We had dinners where we talked about nothing and they felt ordinary and safe, and those nights were precious. We had nights that stung with old wounds, and we learned to sit together through the sting. The biggest turning point came unexpectedly. The school announced a showcase, with parents and community members in the audience, and my aunt asked to come, not to stand beside me as a mirror, but to watch. I was nervous, because she was still capable of shaping rooms with her presence. When I walked on stage and delivered my piece raw, imperfect, undeniably mine, I saw her in the crowd, hands folded, face unreadable. When the applause rose, I looked directly at her. I wanted, in that look, to offer an unspoken exchange. I am me. She is she. We can both exist. Her eyes shimmered, and for the first time I saw something like relief in them, as if the knowledge that I could be myself had lifted a weight she could no longer carry. After the show she came backstage and hugged me in a way that felt like a benediction. She didn't try to take the moment from me. She let it be mine. "I'm proud of you," she said, and I believed it. Maybe what she had wanted all along was to be part of something that mattered, not to be the only thing that mattered. Maybe she needed to know she could lose the act and still be loved. We never reached a perfect reconciliation. Old patterns lingered like a map of places we once traveled. Sometimes she would relapse into possessiveness, sometimes I would regress into doubt. The hard truth was that trust, once fractured in such a fundamental way, takes years to rebuild. But we learned to make promises we could keep: clarity, consent, and the willingness to step back when the other asked. Those promises were small and daily, and, over time, they accumulated into a life that resembled healing. Years passed and I grew into myself in ways that felt both subtle and enormous. I took on bigger roles, met people who knew me for the person I was, not for the echo I'd once been taught to wear. I moved into a small apartment with a crooked balcony where the light hit the floor in a way that made me feel at home. My aunt aged, the lines on her face deepened, and her vanity shrank into a softer, more honest version of herself. She called less often. When she did, it was to share a new photo, or a clumsy joke, or a memory that we both now understood differently. We visited each other like neighbors who had once been closer, careful, kind, aware of the borders we'd both helped redraw. Sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and the city hummed outside, I would stand in front of my mirror and watch my face move. There were nights when the overlap with her terrified me and nights when I just felt like me, pure and little and newly brave. I didn't expect a grand epiphany, and there wasn't one. Identity didn't snap back with a single motion. It accrued, like light on a shelf, thin at first, then thicker, until the reflection in the glass stopped arguing with the person I felt inside. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not tidy. People who hurt often hurt from fear, and people who are molded sometimes yield because the path of least resistance is easier than battle. Recovery is not one person's victory, it's the complicated work of two people discovering that they can be less destructive together than they were apart. And even that is no guarantee. Some stories end in open wounds that never fully close. Ours chose a quieter kind of repair, the kind that lets both of us breathe again. So no, the story never ends in the way fairy tales promise. It keeps going, because life keeps asking for small choices again and again. But if you ask me now, years after the first mirror and the first costume, whether I am still haunted by being made into someone else, I will tell you yes, sometimes. If you ask me whether I would undo everything if I could, I might not know. Painful things sometimes teach us how to be brave. If you ask me whether I am finally my own person, I will look at you and say, with a voice that has learned its own cadences, that I am. Not perfect. Not immune. But myself, and that, for me, was worth every tremble along the way. I thought that once I claimed myself, the world would open cleanly, like a locked door finally swinging wide, but the truth is that even freedom has its shadows. The years after that first stage role were not an endless climb but a road full of curves. I carried both her influence and my defiance like twin weights, and some days one was heavier, some days the other. I learned quickly that identity is not declared once but practiced daily, in 1,000 small ways, and that practice is harder when the ghost of another face lives in your own. College was the first true test. I moved away, into a dorm where no one knew my aunt, no one knew the mirror war I had fought, no one had ever seen me as her twin. For the first few weeks, I waited for someone to notice, for someone to tilt their head and say, "Don't you look just like?" But no one did. They only saw me, awkward, earnest, eager to belong. It was disorienting. Without her shadow cast over me, I felt lighter but also strangely unmoored. Who was I if not the reflection? What pieces of me had grown out of defiance rather than desire? In the theater program I was raw compared to the polished performers around me. But rawness had its own edge. My professors noticed the honesty in my work. They told me that what I lacked in technique, I made up for in presence. One of them said, "You walk on stage like someone who has already survived a storm." I didn't tell them how true that was, but I let their words sink into me. Slowly, I began to trust my own instincts rather than measuring myself against a blueprint someone else had drawn. My aunt called often in those first months, her voice warm but threaded with longing. She wanted to hear everything: what roles I auditioned for, who I spent time with, how the audience reacted. Sometimes her questions felt innocent, other times they felt like a hand trying to pull me back toward her stage. I learned to filter my answers, to share enough to reassure her but not enough to let her rearrange me. When she asked if I was keeping up appearances, I laughed softly and said, "I'm building new ones." There would be silence, then a sigh, then her saying, "Good. That's good." I could never tell if she believed it. The hardest moment came one holiday when I returned home. We were both older, both changed, but the old reflexes lingered. She had prepared 2 dresses for a family dinner, one for her, one for me, both matching. When I saw them laid out, my chest tightened with a memory so sharp it was like stepping backward in time. She smiled nervously, as if waiting for my reaction. I picked up the dress, folded it gently, and set it aside. "Not tonight," I said. "I want to go as me." Her face flickered with something between disappointment and pride. That night I wore my own clothes, simple and plain, and though I felt underdressed beside her, I also felt honest. My mother noticed, and when she squeezed my hand under the table, I knew she understood. The years stretched, and with them came growth. I took roles that scared me, roles that forced me to dig into parts of myself I had once hidden. I failed spectacularly sometimes, forgetting lines, stumbling across the stage, hearing the muffled cough of an unimpressed audience. But each failure belonged to me, and there was a strange kind of joy in that. I no longer measured success by whether I could mirror someone flawlessly. I measured it by whether I could risk being seen in my own imperfect shape. My aunt aged too. The sharpness of her vanity softened into a wistful grace. She still carried herself with elegance, but there was less desperation in it, as if she had finally accepted that being remembered was not the same as being preserved. She started painting in her spare time, portraits not of herself but of landscapes and strangers. When she showed them to me, her hands trembled, but her eyes shone. I told her they were beautiful, and for once I wasn't speaking about her face. There was one evening, years later, that stays with me. We sat together on her porch as the sun set, the sky bruised with color. She turned to me and said, "You know, for the longest time, I thought making you into me was the only way I could survive. But watching you now, I think the only way I survived was by letting you become yourself." I didn't know what to say. So I just rested my head against her shoulder, and for the first time in our tangled history, the silence between us felt safe. Looking back, I realize the story never had a clean ending because life doesn't offer those. It's a series of reckonings, of relapses and recoveries, of choices made again and again. I still see her in me sometimes when I laugh a certain way, when I tilt my head just so. But instead of fear, I feel recognition. She is part of me, yes, but not the whole of me. The rest is mine, shaped by struggle, by courage, by the stubborn insistence that I will not disappear. And maybe that's what identity really is, not a perfect mirror, not an unbroken line, but a patchwork stitched from what we inherit, what we fight, and what we finally choose. Time doesn't erase things, but it reshapes them. Years passed and the sharp edges of what my aunt had done dulled into something I could carry without bleeding each time I touched it. I grew older, my face changed, my voice grew steadier, and people began to know me by the name I had chosen for myself, not the reflection I once wore. I built a career on stage and sometimes on screen, never huge, never the kind of fame my aunt craved, but enough to feel steady, enough to feel like I had carved out a corner of the world that belonged to me. And yet even with all that distance, the story never left. Every time I stepped into a dressing room and looked into the mirror framed with bright lights, there was still a flicker of fear that I might see her before I saw myself. Sometimes I did. Sometimes her expression flashed across my features like a ghost, and I had to blink hard until the glass showed only me again. But instead of crumbling, I would breathe, touch the scar on my hand, whisper one of my lines, and remember that I was not an echo. That practice became ritual, the quiet exorcism I performed before every performance. My aunt grew older too, and with age her sharpness turned into fragility. She stopped hosting grand dinners and throwing parties. She rarely stepped into the spotlight at all. Instead, she became something I never expected, a teacher. She started giving small workshops in community centers, not about beauty or perfection but about presence, confidence, how to stand tall in your own body. The irony was almost too much for me at first. But when I watched her work with young people, I realized she was teaching the opposite of what she had done to me. She wasn't asking them to mirror her. She was urging them to find their own way of being seen. One day, years later, she asked me to come speak to her class. I hesitated for weeks, unsure if I could step back into her orbit without being pulled under again. But eventually I agreed. When I walked into that small, crowded room, A dozen young faces looked at me with curiosity, waiting. My aunt introduced me not as her twin, not as someone she had molded, but as my own name. Just my name. I cannot describe what that moment felt like except to say that my chest loosened as if some invisible chain had finally snapped. I told the class my story, not all of it, not the darkest pieces, but enough. I told them that identity is something fragile and precious, that people will try to tell you who you are, and sometimes their voices will be so loud you forget your own. I told them that the hardest work you will ever do is not learning to become someone else but learning to remain yourself in a world that asks for mirrors. The room was quiet as I spoke, and when I finished, one of the students raised her hand and asked softly, "So how do you know when you've found yourself?" I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "You know," I said, "when you can look in the mirror and see both your history and your future in the same face and feel at peace with both." When I stepped down, my aunt looked at me with eyes full of something I had never seen in them before. Not pride, not possession, not vanity. Just gratitude. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. In that silence, I finally believed she had let go of needing me to be her. Years later, after she passed away, I found myself standing in front of another mirror, this time in her old house, which had been left mostly untouched. Her vanity table still had brushes and bottles neatly lined up, like a shrine to the life she once lived. For a long time I just stared at it, remembering the nights when those same tools had reshaped me into her image. My hands shook as I picked up one of the brushes, but instead of fear, I felt a strange calm. I set it back down, looked into the mirror, and saw only myself. Older now, lined in places, weathered by choices and time. And for the first time, I didn't flinch. I walked out of that room and shut the door gently behind me. It didn't feel like slamming a chapter closed. It felt like finally leaving it in the past, not erased, not denied, but acknowledged and finished. I carried her with me, but I carried myself more. That balance was the ending I had fought for all along. And if there's one truth I've learned from it all, it's this: sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to vanish. To hold on to the small, stubborn sparks that make you who you are and protect them until they burn steady enough to light the rest of your life. That's what I did. That's what I keep doing. And that, in the end, is how I survived being made into someone else, never giving up on becoming myself.